Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wei Yang. I am an associate at the Carbon Trust. Yeah, so just a bit of a background of my company. So we are a climate consultancy, and we have been at the forefront of pioneerizing decarbonization efforts for over 2 decades of experience. We have partnered with governments, businesses, and organizations to develop innovative solutions aimed at addressing the pressing climate crisis. So our Singapore office operates across Southeast Asia to advance our mission, which is to accelerate the transition towards a decarbonized future. So here's our agenda for today. So we'll start off with an overview of the ASEAN SME Climate Change Guidelines, followed by deep diving into the fundamentals of decarbonization to SMEs. Thirdly, we'll talk about responding to climate crisis and what are some of the support schemes for decarbonization. And we'll keep some time for Q&A. So I'm very glad today to have the opportunity to present an overview of the ASEAN SME Climate Change Guidelines, which serve as a framework for SMEs navigating the complexities of climate change within their business operations. Apologies, yeah, hold on for the technical glitch. Yeah, we can move to the next slide. Thanks.
All right. A very good afternoon to everyone. There was some technical challenges which we are trying to resolve. But in the meantime, I'll try to present my session, which is about fundamentals of decarbonization for SMEs. So, first question first, how many of you are from SMEs in this room? Just a show of hand will do. I promise I won't be asking any question. Just a show of hands. How many of you are SMEs? No one? All of you are from big corporates? All right, but no worries. What we are covering here today is also applicable for the MNCs as well, because MNCs need to do their scope 1 and scope 2 footprinting as well. And there will be an element of scope 3 that we'll be covering as well. So without further ado, let's start. Maybe I have to first introduce myself. My name is Prannoy. I'm a senior consultant at Carbon Trust Singapore office. And we are here to basically share what we have done recently for the ASEAN SMEs. And this session is more about fundamentals of decarbonization. So at the end of my session, my objective is hopefully you all can start your scope 1 and scope 2 footprinting. with the tools that we have developed, and there will be hands-on exercises as well that we'll be doing. So what we'll be covering is three main parts to the session. First is the measurement or carbon footprinting. Second is setting the target and what's the decarbonization plan, how you can decarbonize. And finally is about implementing the plan and monitoring the progress. Because route to net zero is a long route. It's by 2050 that we all need to be net zero in line with the 1.5-degree trajectory. So that's what we'll be covering in the three sessions. So this is a typical decarbonization journey taken by a corporate. It can be SME, it can be an MNC, it can be a financial institute as well. So what it starts with is the measurement. Measurement is the fundamental. There is a saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. So first is and foremost is measurement. And what you do, there are two main types of measurement. The first is end-to-end footprinting. Basically, you measure the impact of your organization on the climate, which is basically outward looking. And at the same time, you have to measure your climate risks as well, which is basically when your organization is operating in the warmer world, there will be certain risks that your organization will be exposed to. So you have to do that measurement as well, which is more of inward looking, how the world around is changing and what are the risks and opportunities that the climate change is bringing to you. So those two are the fundamental measurements that need to be done. And I believe if you are from corporates, you have already started. So maybe I can ask, just a show of hands, who all have done their scope 1 and 2 footprinting? Great. Anyone else? Great. All right, you show 2 hands. Does that mean you have done your scope 3 as well? Anyone who has done scope 3, like full scope 3, not just few categories, full scope 3? All right, so I'll say, yeah, the corporates are also kind of on their journey. And if you have not done your scope 3, that will mean you haven't done your target setting as well, which is the science-based target setting. So this session will be useful for all of you who are in this room basically. So, and once you have done your measurement, basically, the next step is basically on setting the target. So measurement is just a measurement, you know. We all need to work towards keeping the global temperature below 1.5 degrees centigrade, and that's where the target setting comes into the place. And the best way to set a target is what the science is saying, to keep our global temperatures below 1.5 degrees centigrade. So it should not be based on what we feel, what we can do. It's what the science is saying, how much and how quickly we need to reduce in the midterm as well as in the long term, which is the net zero latest by 2050. And once you have set a target, it's not just about setting target, it's about how you are going to achieve those targets. You need to have a roadmap, you need to have a plan to achieve that. So it's a very strategic exercise that we do with a lot of corporates. So, I mean, sustainability, decarbonization is more and more becoming a part of the strategy departments of the corporates. I mean, most of you are here from the big corporates. I believe the strategy department is also in charge of the decarbonization plan for your organization. So once you have designed the roadmap, the next is implement and monitor. This is so crucial and so important to implement successfully what you have planned. And once you are implementing it year-on-year basis, is the communication of the target and the engagement of your stakeholders. So I mean, nowadays investors are looking at your emissions because they want to make sure their investments are secure, there are not enough risk. The board members are looking at it, your customers are looking at it, so all the stakeholders are looking at corporates, how they are measuring and reducing their carbon emissions as well. So implement and monitoring and communication and engagement is very crucial. It has to be done on a regular basis, probably on an annual basis. So these are the 3 things that we'll be covering. Let's start with the measurement and carbon footprint. This slide is a very basic slide. I think we all know what is greenhouse gas, warming, why the earth is warming. So if I have to summarize, before the industrial revolution began, the emissions and the removal were quite balanced. But since 1950, we started to have industrial activities. We started to release all these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And because of that, the sun's, basically the visible rays which come to the earth, a lot of it is absorbed and then it is reflected back from the surface of the earth as well in terms of infrared radiations. We can't see that, but those infrared radiations are trapped by these greenhouse gases. And because of this, our Earth is warming. And as per the scientists, our Earth has already warmed around 1.5 degrees centigrade as compared to pre-industrial level, which is 1850. And that the golden number is basically 1.5 degrees centigrade. So we all have to pursue our efforts not to breach that 1.5 degrees centigrade marks, because we'll see more and more, catastrophic events, more and more extreme weather events as well, which will impact our society and economy as well. So, this slide is from SBTi. As you can see, you can assume this is like a balance. On the left-hand side is all the emissions, and on the right-hand side are all the removals. So before the Industrial Revolution, the balance was perfectly balanced. All the emissions were equal to all the removals, basically. But since we started all these industrial activities, it led to accumulation of these greenhouse gases, including CO2 and other greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere. And because of that, currently, we are imbalanced. And because of this imbalance, the global temperature is rising, and it is leading to a lot of climate risk, which is both transition risk as well as physical risk. So our objective is to make this balanced again. Just by focusing on CO2 removals, it's not that possible. It's not physically possible. A lot of people are talking about direct air carbon capture. We can grow as many number of trees as possible, but just removals won't help. So what is required is we need to reduce the GHG emissions that we have been doing for more than a century. So that's the immediate requirement which all of us need to focus on. So as I said earlier, knowing your organization's carbon footprint is the fundamental way to start, because it needs to be a very strategic exercise. You need to understand where most of your emissions are coming from, and then you need to focus all your efforts, all your resources, all your budgets towards reducing those kind of emissions. So measurement is fundamental to your decarbonization journey. By the way, this is a workshop, so please, if you have any questions, do pause me. Rather than taking questions right at the end, we can take the questions as and when it comes to your mind. So fundamental of carbon footprinting, what exactly carbon footprinting is? So by definition, a carbon footprint is the total greenhouse gas emissions caused by direct and indirect activities of an individual. The carbon footprint can be at an individual level, like I have my carbon footprint. For if I look at like what I've done for the last 1 year, where I've traveled, what I'm doing, what I'm eating, so all those will contribute to individual carbon footprint. But what is most important is organizational carbon footprint. You all are working for an organization, and that organization is measuring its carbon footprint. Then there can be footprint of an event as well. A lot of our clients are trying to do the event carbon footprint as well. So this event has a carbon footprint as well, like how many days the event was run, how much electricity was used, how much cooling energy for cooling was used, what type of food was served, how we all commuted, are we flying from overseas. All those will contribute to the event carbon footprinting as well. Interesting, if you can go to Qatar FIFA World Cup, there was a event carbon footprinting done for that as well. If you have interest, you can read that report. Another footprinting is at the product level as well. So like for example, this mic has a footprint as well. So a lot of suppliers, when they sell the product, a lot of the consumers are asking, when you're doing your scope 3 footprint category 1, which is the supplier, the goods and services, you will be asking the emission factors. So there will be an emission factor associated with the product, and more of our customers have started to do the product carbon footprinting as well to come up with that emission factors. So just before my session, we were discussing about the greenhouse gases. See, you all might have read this small letter E after CO2, which is basically the equivalence. So it means we are not talking about only CO2, but it also takes into account the other greenhouse gases which has been taken into consideration. So that's what the carbon footprinting is. Basically, how much is the overall greenhouse gas emissions for a product, individual, or at an organization level. All greenhouse gases are different, and sometimes when we work with the client, we tell them, how much is your refrigerant leak? We all use, chillers and all, and we top up the refrigerants in those chiller systems, although it can be just few kgs. A lot of clients will say, oh, just a few kg, I didn't even record for it. But even if it is few kgs, the greenhouse warming potential can be significant. as you can see over here, if carbon dioxide is considered like it increases the temperature by 1 equivalent, sulfur hexafluoride, any one of you knows where sulfur hexafluoride is used? Any one of you in the power transmission and distribution industry? It is used in transformers as an insulator, and it has one of the highest greenhouse warming potential, around 23,500 times. So 1 kg or greenhouse of sulfur hexafluoride is equivalent to 23 times basically the greenhouse warming potential. That's why even a small quantity of top up can have a big CO2 equivalent basically. So that's the message in this slide. Like, it's not just about carbon, about other gases which can have higher greenhouse warming potential, and that's why these gases are equally important as well. So what is the fundamental of carbon footprinting? What is the basic building block? There are two main things which, if you all have done scope 1 and 2, the two main things that you need to have a carbon footprint is your activity data. Like for example, if you are doing your scope 2, how much is your kilowatt hours of energy used, how many liters of fuel was consumed, or how many kilometers of your vehicle have traveled. So that's the activity data. Next is the carbon intensity. We call it emission factor. And once you multiply the activity data by the emission factor, which is CO2e per kilowatt hour per liter or per kilometer, you will get your carbon emissions. So this is a very, very simple equation. But when you add all the activities together, you will get your organization scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 as well. It's much simpler to say than to do, especially for scope 3. It can be very complicated, especially the emission factor and the type of activity data that you need to gather. But if you were SMEs, you can start to focus only on scope 1 and 2 first. That's more than enough. So how to calculate organizational carbon footprinting? There are total 6 steps. The first step is decide on the method. So there are 2 main methods usually adopted by corporates. One is called the GHG protocol, which I'm sure you all must have heard of. Next is also the ISO standard, ISO 14064-1. It's a series of standards under ISO. ISO 14064-3 is used for verification. So we as a consultant, we as an auditor, use that standard to verify the emissions coming from an organization. But I mean, you can use either or. There is no difference. It's just the terminology is how they say what are the direct and indirect emissions. Anyone using ISO in this room for reporting their emissions? If no, then I assume everyone is using GHG protocol for their emissions. Is that correct? Because there's no other, so you must be using either or out of these. All right. And if you are doing your scope 1, scope 2, or started on scope 3, this diagram must be very, very familiar to you. So scope 1 is basically the direct emissions which are coming from the operations, which is basically you might have a diesel genset. If you are in power industry, you might be generating power by burning natural gas. So all those, and from the fugitive gas emissions all come under scope 1. And scope 2 is basically all the energy that you import into your company. Basically, it can be electricity, it can be heating, it can be cooling that you're using in your company. That will be under scope 2. And then starts the scope 3, which is divided into total 15 categories, and it is subdivided into upstream and the downstream categories as well. I mean, I won't be going into all the 15 categories in this session because typically we conduct this session in Singapore for over 2 full days, and there we go in detail into each of those scope 3 categories. But here we don't have that much time, so we'll be focusing more on the scope 1 and scope 2 and how it is done. But if you have any questions on scope 3, please do let us know. We have written the technical guidance for the scope 3 as well, which is freely available on the internet. So if you just Google scope 3 technical guidance, you will be able to find the guidance document as well. So let's deep dive into scope 1 emissions. The scope 1 emission, as I said, are emissions occurring from the sources owned or controlled by the company. So it can be further divided into 4 parts. Stationary combustion, as the name suggests, it is coming from the sources which are stationary. So if you have a diesel genset which is stationary, those will be under stationary combustion. It can be from furnaces, it can be from turbines, depending on the business you are in. Next is mobile combustion, as the name suggests. If it is a vehicle which is moving around, which is under your control, basically, you have purchased it or you have the operational control, then it will be under mobile combustion. If you are into some kind of process industries, the emissions can come from the processes directly as well. Like for example, cement industry, steel industry, they can have direct emissions as well. When iron ore is being changed into steel and all, you will have direct scope 1 emissions under your process emissions. Next to the fugitive emissions, as I said, it's a top-up which is being done in the chiller plant. So those fugitive emissions, if relevant for your industry, need to be accounted as well. Next is the scope 2 emissions, which probably will be most significant for all of you because every organization uses scope 2 or the electricity. And scope 2, there is a basically a dedicated guideline available from GHG protocol on how to do the scope 2 footprinting. So we'll be touching a bit more details on that. What is location based, what is market based, scope 2 footprinting is. All right, so I mean this slide is pretty important. This is a very basic step when you start to do your footprinting, which is about defining the organizational and operational boundaries as well. So the first thing first is about your the time period. The time period for your any footprinting has to be 12 consecutive months. It can be your calendar year, it can be your financial year as well. Ideally, clients will like to align it to their basically financial reporting period as well. So most of you might have aligned it as well. So once you have decided that, next is the organizational boundary. So a lot of big corporates, they have parent company, they have subsidiaries and all as well. So you need to define what your organizational boundary is. An organizational boundary can be defined in several ways, which is on the next slide. There are two main types how you do it. One is called the equity, another is control. So equity is basically there are a lot of investment companies who just invest, they have some equity ownership in that organization. So that's one way how you can report your emissions, or you can form your boundary of the organization. Basically, whichever companies the organization have invested in will become or you have equity basically in that company. That will follow the equity control approach. Next is the operational control, which can be of two types. One is operational control or financial control. I mean, I've worked in this for several years and I've seen most of the organizations using operational control approach, but some organizations do go for like financial control approach as well. But operational control is very easy to understand as well, as long as you have a control of operation policies and everything of an organization that has to be reported under your basically the organizational boundary. But some clients do use financial control as well. So basically they might not have direct operational control, but they have financial control. They can bring in policies and all, then they will start to use the financial control as well. But most common is the operational control, which I've seen. So this is how you define your operational boundary. And once you have defined your operational boundary, is basically coming up with the, organizational boundary, you define your operational boundary. Within your organization, there will be different sources of emissions, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So you define which one you want to start with. You want to stick to only scope 1 and 2 first, then move on to scope 3. Ideally, you should be, if you are big corporate, you should be doing your scope 1, 2, and 3 all together, because most of your emissions will be coming from scope 3. So scope 3 is really, really important, especially for the big companies. All right, so once you have done your organizational boundary, you have defined your boundaries, next is start to collect the data. So and this can be a very tricky exercise as well, especially with the big corporates. You might be spread over several countries and all. So you need to have a good kind of sessions with those data holders to basically get the data. So start to collect the data on a regular basis. Also start to have identify anomalies as well. We have seen a lot of times the data inputted into the Excel sheet is not correct as well. So please ensure you have a quality assurance, quality check processes in place, that the data that on the invoice and what is being inputted in the Excel sheet is correct as well. But anyway, when we do the assurance, we do check that, but it's always good for you to make sure the data inputted are correct, and you have like basically the interventions in place, how the QA/QC process works in your organization. And data, especially for scope 3, data can be in many different forms. So you can, every year, you should try to improve the data quality basically. So I'll be covering that slide, what are the different type of data which will be required under scope 1, 2, and 3 as well. But this is typically for scope 1 and 2. These are things which are easily available in your organizations. Like for electricity and gas, you might have an automatic the meters readings which might be available. Definitely you will have some invoices, because when you're purchasing electricity from someone, you are paying them. So this is the least data we expect the clients will have. And then if you have any manual meter readings, if your maintenance team is logging how much is being consumed on an everyday basis or a monthly basis, you can use those as a basis to start calculating your footprint as well. Then if you have on-site gensets or power generation or CHP plants, you should have some invoices for the fuel which is being used by them. If you have a fleet, you will have fuel cards, how much is being spent to run those vehicles and all. So those data is quite easily available from your procurement department or your from finance department as well. Next is the refrigerant, which I mentioned. Typically the maintenance team should collect and keep a log of F-gas as well. It can be outsourced to someone, it can be internally your maintenance team might be procuring the F-gases and keeping an inventory of that as well. And this is the hierarchy of data basically, which is relevant to the scope 3 as well. So as you can see, primary data is the most accurate form of data. Basically, you will have a lot of confidence if you're using the primary data that whatever emissions you're calculating is as accurate as possible. And what is primary data? Like for example, if you have liters of fuels, if you have kilowatt of hours for your electricity, all those are primary data. And when you're collecting those data, please collect evidences as well, as I mentioned in the earlier slide, because it will be required for if you're going for external audit purposes. So we generally check all the evidences as well together with the data. If the primary data is not available, especially for scope 3, primary data might not be available, you can go for estimates based on proxy. Like for example, you might not have the actual fuel consumed, but you might have the cost, how much you spent on the fuel to procure those fuels. So we can use that data as well. Or you might have, instead of how much fuel was burnt in the vehicle, you might have how many kilometers that vehicle traveled. So that can also be used to calculate scope 3. And finally, if you don't even have that, next can be based on estimated, basically on similarities or proxies. So basically, if it is an MNC, recently we worked with an organization that was spread across several countries. Some countries do have the data, some countries didn't have the data. So what we used was basically for energy consumption, we came up with a metrics, kilowatt hour per meter square on certain, so we expected similar energy consumption across their different countries as well, because the business activity essentially remains the same. So we found that metrics was pretty suitable, so we filled the gap using these benchmark figures as well. And there are certain industry level numbers available as well. So those industry like kind of average numbers can be used as well to start your footprinting. But ultimately, we all should aim to have primary data. If not this year, slowly over time, try to get more and more primary data from your suppliers and whoever you're procuring your services from. All right, so once you have collected the data, if you remember my earlier slide, you need two things. One is the activity data and the emission factor. So once your activity data is done, you need to find out your emission factor. So emission factors, as you can see, you can get it from IEA. IEA is the International Energy Agency, and it can be used for the scope 2, but IEA charges. Basically, you have to give some money to IEA to access those databases. Even EcoInvent is used a lot for scope 3 footprinting, and that is again a paid database. So we have the license, so whenever we work with the clients, we try to use IEA and EcoInvent data. But if your operations are only in Malaysia, you can use the TNB databases as well. The important thing is to be consistent. So typically, IEA is the one which publishes data for all the countries. So if an organization has multiple operations across the countries, we try to use IEA database just for the consistency. But if you are only in Malaysia, you can definitely use TNB or other national level emission factors that are available. Then there are sector-specific emission factors like FAO for agriculture, and there are some research, credible research organizations that are publishing emission factors. Then there are some others. BIS is freely available and very commonly used. So I believe a lot of you might be using BIS emission factors, which is quite comprehensive. And yes, you can use BIS emission factors as well, freely available. Then there is GABI. Then there is one from German emission factors. This is just to illustrate how to calculate emissions. So once you have electricity, basically the emission source of electricity, you already know how much is your kilowatt hours of energy used from your invoice. You multiply it by the emission factor, it's 0.26. 0.26 really good emission factor over here. I think in Malaysia it's around 0.7, in Singapore it's around 0.4, but this means the grid is really decarbonized. And once you multiply these two, you'll get your emission matrix. Similarly for diesel, you understand what is the amount used and you multiply it with the emission factor for diesel and you get the emission. So basically you just keep adding these for all the activities, and when you sum it up, you will get your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Just a bit more deep dive into scope 2. So there can be two types of scope 2 footprinting. One is called location based, another is called market based. Because you all might have heard of renewable energy certificates, and a lot of organizations wants to use renewable energy certificates to claim reduction in their scope 2. And renewable energy certificates are perfectly perfect to use to claim reductions in your scope 2. It's not same as carbon offsets. Carbon offsets are totally different. Renewable energy certificates are totally different. They are meant for different purposes. Carbon offsets, whereas renewable energy certificate is to basically you're procuring energy from green sources. So I mean, you might, and there might be some, renewable energy service or the electricity providers available to you as well. They might say we have a plan, we can provide you electricity, which is basically bundled with renewable energy certificates. And for those kind of electricity, you can use emission factor of 0. I mean, you're still consuming electricity, but you can use emission factor of 0 to claim your emissions are basically 0. And that's why it is important to report both location-based and market-based. Location-based is basically the grid average. What is the average electric source in the grid? Because grid can be, the electricity can be going into grid from coal-fired power plant, it can be from renewable, from hydro. So there will be a grid average emission factor for, let's say TNB, there are few grids in Malaysia, but let's say for one particular grid, there will be emission factor produced by the TNB. But for the market-based, if you're buying renewable energy certificates from outside, you can actually, when you do the market-based, you will have a market-based emission factor lower than your grid. And that's when, we will, just by reading it, we will looking at the two numbers, we will understand how much effort the organization or corporate is putting by, putting solar panels on the rooftop, by buying renewable energy certificates, going above and beyond what the grid is. So these are the two which I think every organization should report, location-based and market-based emission factor. Then these two are totally optional, but big organization MNC wants to demonstrate like credibility in their numbers. So a lot of them want to go for verification of their footprinting. So basically it can be just scope 1 and 2, or it can be scope 3 audit or assurance of those numbers. And then we have our own labels as well, which is to certify reduction as well. So I'm not going to go into more details. So we recently launched this Route to Net Zero labels, which is currently being used by a lot of organizations to claim they're on the path to net zero. All right, it's time for some hands-on activity. And it won't take much time. I hope you all, I don't see laptops with anyone. So maybe what you can do is you can scan a barcode and it will take you to a calculator, a very simple exercise. So what we'll be showing you is basically 3 invoices. One is the electricity invoice, another is the vehicle fuel invoice, and also the refrigerant log. And yeah, this is the QR code to take you to that calculator. And this calculator we developed together with GITA, basically for ASEAN SMEs. So the calculator is focusing only on scope 1 and 2 and typical categories. However, the assumption is all the operations of that company is in Singapore. So I hope everyone has downloaded, have a link to the calculator. Once you go to the website, there will be a further link to the calculator. You just have to click that, and that will take you to the, all good? Should I move on? Maybe 10 more seconds if you all have downloaded. Okay, all right, it seems everyone has downloaded. So let's start with the exercise. So there are 3 basically invoices, quotations. The first one is for the scope 1 mobile combustion. So I don't know whether it is, you can read it, but can you identify how much is the fuel consumption in this invoice? And by the way, all these are from Singapore, so yeah. Yeah, anyone, how much is the fuel consumption? mean, there are dollar values, and there is fuel. Anyone got it? 43, correct. 43.079 to be more precise, but 43 is correct, yeah. So that's for the scope 1. Let's go into the fugitive emissions. So anyone who can, so you have to identify two things over here. One is how much the quantity. Yeah. Sorry, this one is it? Yeah, so I mean this one is 43.079, as you can see from here, the diesel consumption. It's a diesel. Yeah, amount used is 43.079. All right, you got it? Next is the fugitive emission. So here you need to identify two things, the type of refrigerant gas and the quantity. And as you can see over here, this is a very real example. The handwriting was not so good, so even we had difficulties on seeing what the number is. But can anyone, okay, first thing, which refrigerant gas is it? Oh, I'm already showing actually the answers over here. So it's R410A is the type of refrigerant, and the amount is basically 7.066 kgs. All right, hopefully everyone got it. The next is basically the amount of electricity. So this is a typical electricity bill in Singapore, and you can find out how much is the emissions from the electricity. Is everyone with me? Yep, you're right. Yep, you're right. 434.19. All right. So hopefully you all have the data that needs to be inputted in the tool, or you might be already inputting it into the tool. So maybe I can start showing you the results as well. So hopefully you have inputted vehicle fleet as an activity type, fuel type is diesel, and then the amount as well. And the next is the fugitive emissions, the type of fuel, which is the refrigerant type, and then the amount used as well. And once you input it, you will automatically get the numbers as well. And next is for the scope 2 as well, where you input your amount of kilowatt hours of energy consumed, and you will get, finally you will get some analysis done as well, how much the scope 1 and scope 2. Whether this is a bit tricky question, where scope 1 is really high, whereas scope 2 is a bit low. Can anyone guess what type of industry it might be representing, where scope 1 is very high, scope 2 is very low? Transportation, yep. It can be a power generation company as well, because they use a lot of fuel to generate power. All right, so I mean, yeah, you have the link, please play with the tool even after, and you can try to use the data from your organization, put it in the tool as well, and try to see how it works. Next is setting the targets. So you have done the measurements. Next part is basically how do you set a target? So, I mean, I'm not going to cover, the details of how many ASEAN countries have done. So basically, the point is the government have already committed, a lot of government have committed to net zero latest by 2050. But government themselves are not able to come up with, like the regulations. They can't do that. Basically, they are looking for businesses and corporates to help them decarbonize as well. And there is a big ambition gap as per the current policies, what decarbonization we will be doing versus what we need to be doing to keep the global temperature below 1.5 degrees centigrade. So as you can see over here, the green band and the orange band, that's the big gap that we need to fill by 2030. Because if we just rely on the government to come up with the policies, we are not going to get there. The corporates need to start looking into decarbonization on a voluntary basis as well. And how do business look? That's why businesses look into the science-based target setting. What does the science is saying? How much and how quickly they need to decarbonize. So that's what brings us to the next session, which is on the science-based target initiative. So Science Based Target Initiative is, these are the founding members, CDP, UNGC, WRI, and WWF, and they are kind of, a unifying body which validates the target and which provides technical assistance to the companies as well on how they can set the target and get their targets validated. And there's a net zero corporate standard which was released around 2 years back as well. So that's the standard which corporates are using to set their net zero targets. So there was a question earlier about what is the difference between net zero and carbon neutral as well. So that's a question we get asked a lot of time, and they're totally different as well. So net zero is defined by Science Based Target Initiative, and there are two key elements to the net zero as per SBTi. First is reducing the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions to zero or to a residual level, and the trajectory or the pathway is so important as well. The pathway has to be aligned to the 1.5 degrees centigrade. Because when we talk about net zero, we talk about 2050. So it's not like we can keep increasing our emissions and finally in the last 5 years we suddenly drop it. That's not how the climate science works basically. So we need to follow this pathway, which is the 1.5 degrees centigrade pathway, even for our near-term targets and definitely for the long-term targets as well. And whatever the remaining or the residual level of emissions is basically what cannot be reduced, need to be neutralized. So the term is neutralization. And neutralization needs to be done at the really at the end of your net zero journey when you have already reduced around 90% of your emissions. And the recommendation is company need to prioritize decarbonization, which is basically reducing your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions over and above offsetting. Offsetting does have a role to play as well, but that's offsetting doesn't contribute to reductions. So reduce your scope 1, 2, and 3 is key rather than offsetting. But there is a role for offsetting. I'll be covering that in the next slide. So you all might have seen this graph from SBTi, which basically shows, on the x-axis is basically the time frame. So the net zero is a state where the amount of emissions that an organization is emitting is balanced by the removal type of carbon offsets. So the GHG removal type. So that's a 2050 state. But as of today, probably your 2021, 2022, or baseline emissions are these dark, the maroon color graph. But as per SBTi, there are two types of target. One is the near-term target that you need to achieve in next 5 to 10 years, basically. So that's the number 1 over here, as you can see. These are the near-term targets. And there are different requirements for scope 1, 2, and scope 3, because scope 3 is difficult to reduce. That's why the requirement for scope 1 and 2 is it needs to be aligned to 1.5 degree trajectory pathway. Whereas for scope 3 in near term, it can be well below 2 degrees centigrade, which is 1.75 degree pathway. But there's an option for 1.5 as well. So basically, a lot of organizations are keeping their ambition for reducing their scope 1, 2, and 3 all to 1.5 degree centigrade pathway as well. Whereas for long term, the targets is it's absolute reduction. Scope 1 and 2 need to be reduced by 90%, and also your scope 3 need to be reduced by 90% as well when it's like around latest by 2050. And whatever is remaining, that need to be neutralized, which is the number 4. And these are the removal types of carbon offsets. So if you remember that balance, like the offsets which actually remove carbon directly from the air, those type of carbon offsets are eligible to claim your net zero basically. But you might have heard of there's so many types of carbon offsets, which is basically avoided emissions type of carbon offset. All those have a role to play in the which is called beyond value chain mitigation basically, because you can help others to basically decarbonize as well. You can invest in technologies, you can invest in carbon offset. Basically you will need carbon offsets later, maybe 20 years down the line. But if you can buy carbon offsets now, the removal type for the future market, you can help others, or the beyond your own value chain, you can help to mitigate the carbon emissions as well. So that's what the science-based targets that talks about the carbon offsets and what are the different trajectories. Any questions anyone have on this? Anyone of you have committed to science-based targets? Great. You've committed to science-based targets, right?
Just going by your definition of net zero, your previous slide. So reducing scope 1, 2, and 3 emission to zero.
Zero or to a residual
or to below the
Residual.
residual level consistent with 1.5.
because
So,
go
so
ahead.
just going by zero only, it means the company gonna close down.
No, that doesn't mean your company will close down. Like for example, let's talk about
RE, they
talk-
they use RE.
RE is one of them. Yeah. So I mean, let's say, I mean, definitely you will need energy, right? You will need electrons to run your company.
Yeah, not everyone can afford RE.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, don't confuse, like science-based target is asking you to reduce your growth, company growth, or your financial activity. No, that is not the objective. Basically, the financial profitability of the company as well as the decarbonization can go hand in hand. It's not like they are opposite to each other. If you start to decarbonize, you have to basically compromise on your profitability. That's not the case.
Please remind me, I think when the Ministry of Natural Resource report to IPCC, they don't report based on scope 1, 2, and 3. Am I right? And then there's this decarbonization per capita that was not accepted. What was the controversy? Just for understanding.
I mean, that is totally different type of accounting. That is called like the national level. You might have heard the term NDCs, nationally determined contribution. So that's what the nations report to UNFCCC basically. But what we are talking about here, all these are for corporates, as you can see over here. It's for the corporates and businesses. So those are two different accountings which are being followed. But I mean, we can go for that accounting standard as well, national level. There are several consumption-based and production-based, yeah. But we are not, because the focus here is on corporates and that too on SMEs, yeah. Maybe we can have a discussion on that sometime later. All right, so, yeah. Oh, for the, you mean to say at the, right at the,
I mean like for offsets, because we need to abate, right, for SBTI. Then there's the minimal one that you cannot reduce anymore, the
Correct.
residual one,
Yep.
then you offset.
yeah,
What's the percentage of?
that's the 10%. So basically if you see
Fixed,
over here, 90% reduction, and the 10% can be, the term they use is neutralization.
I see.
Neutralization.
Okay.
It's not called offsetting, it's called neutralization, yeah.
But it's the same.
Yeah, I mean, I have a slide on different type of offsets and what type of offsets can be used for neutralization.
Sure.
And what, so I'll be covering that.
One more question on
Yep.
the REC, right? Can we define REC as a limited carbon credit just for scope 2? Can we do it that way?
I won't say don't use the term carbon credit for RECs
Yeah.
because it's a renewable energy certificate. So it's a certificate that a 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy was generated somewhere and
Yeah.
which displaced, like the coal-fired energy or something. So
Yeah.
renewable energy certificate can only be used for scope 2, but don't call it a carbon offset here. That's not the term typically used.
Yeah, but we can take carbon credit and an offset because when we take a whole organization one, you get 1, 2, 3 all combined together, right?
Yep.
When you use carbon credit to offset, you cover everything anyways, right?
Yeah. But I mean, as per science-based target, carbon offsets are not a way to reduce.
And only for the 10%.
Only for the 10%, that to a certain type of carbon offsets, which is the removal type. And those type of carbon offsets are very expensive, around 200 to 300 US dollars per ton currently. Those are very, very expensive. And they're not even available in the market. So if you go to, carbon exchange, you say, I want a removal type of carbon offsets, availability is also not there, but so expensive.
So it's better to take the REC then.
REC, yeah, REC is totally fine, but REC will only reduce your scope 2. It won't reduce your scope 1 or scope 3.
Does it fall under neutralization for REC?
No.
Oh, so REC I can take it.
REC you can start to use now. Actually,
So that's the difference.
Yeah, that's the difference here.
So for if let's say I'm using like a certain amount of kilowatt hours energy, I can REC everything, right?
You can, yeah.
Under SBTI.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
And if you want further detail, there is something called RE100 as well. So there are guidance available. So and you can use GHG protocol scope 2 as well for that. But there are certain requirements. It has to be connected to the grid and all. And Singapore is facing a big problem. We're expecting to import green energy from Malaysia and also, yeah. Hopefully we all can work together, bring the emissions down.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, how do you demonstrate that by achieving a 90% reduction, that the quantity that you have reduced in scope 1 and 2 is consistent with the 1.5 degree pathway?
So I mean, when you set a science-based target, right, there are tools available. Basically, you have to use those tools from Science-Based Target Initiative, or you can work with a consultant like us, and we will basically chart out this pathway. So this is the trajectory, as you can see, the dotted line, which is a 1.5 aligned emission pathway. So, and these are the year-on-year reductions. So if your reductions are in line with this trajectory, yes, you are on the right path to 1.5. But if it is higher than this, that means you're not aligned with the 1.5. Yeah, the tools are available, freely available on the SBTI. Yeah, you can use them.
Commodities and
Mm.
items to reduce scope 3 by
Uh-huh.
90%. That means I build invisible buildings. I don't need
Ah,
materials.
no, not really, not really. So it's difficult definitely to reduce. Basically, if you are into the construction industry, you are using a lot of steel, and those are very, very difficult to decarbonize.
Steel and cement, both.
Steel, cement, correct. And even like, so you might have to look at alternate materials as well. Like for example, like timber and all, and other maybe more sustainable materials as well. But it's not just about the material as well. I mean, another thing is the transportation as well. So if you're buying it from far away, right, the upstream transport and distribution will be very high. So you need to try to source for like locally. So scope 3, that embodied carbon is one thing, but there are other like scope 3 emissions as well. So if that is something that's very difficult, maybe you can leave it for later. You can start with the low-hanging fruit first to decarbonize them first.
So which means if the company want to go for SBTI, I would only go for scope 1 and 2 first?
No.
Like, I can't. I have to
You can't.
1 to 3.
SBTI requirement is you have to include scope 3 as well, because that's where most of the impact. If you have done your scope 1, 2, and 3, you will see your scope 3 will like look like big. Scope 1 and 2 is just small. So organizations need to really focus on their scope 3. It's very important. And if this presentation was supposed to be for SMEs. For SMEs, if they start to decarbonize their scope 1 and 2, they will be helping the big companies basically to decarbonize as well. So all the MNCs will be looking for, the SMEs which are already reducing their scope 1 and 2. So there's an opportunity as well. It's not just risky thing. There's a business opportunity. If you can make your business more greener, more sustainable, your products are more greener, less carbon intense, you can grow your business very well as well. It's not just about risk. It's about a lot of opportunities as well that the climate change is bringing in. All right, I think let's move on. We have quite a few things to cover. So this slide is about why to set a science-based target. So it builds credibility because your reductions are aligned to the science. What the science is saying, because our ultimate objective is to keep the global temperature below 1.5 degrees centigrade. It demonstrates commitment to climate action. It anticipates the change, basically the risk. So if you're setting a science-based target, you're reducing your emissions. You are basically mitigating those risks. You enhance your business resilience and competitiveness. It provides a third-party independent assessment on your targets. It enables comparability, leverages on strong recognition. SBTI is the only basically organization which helps to reduce or validates your target as well. And that makes sense. There should be only one organization which should be validating all the targets for all the organizations. So I included this slide specifically for SMEs. We had a slide for MNCs as well. So there are slightly less stringent requirements for SMEs, and how an SME is defined by SBTI is basically anyone with less than 500 employees is defined as SME, except for the financial institutions and oil and gas industries. They will still need to follow the sectorial guidelines. But this is, I think if no one is from SME, yeah, go ahead.
SBTI scope 3, according to SPI, to cover for scope 3, how many percentage minimum of the operations?
For near term, it's around 2/3, which is around 66%. That should be in your boundary for scope 3.
Near term is 2/3.
But yeah, 2/3, around 66% of the scope 3. But for the long term, I think you need to have around 90% of all your emissions included in your boundary. Correct. So basically, if you have 15 categories in scope 3, you need to have at least 2/3 of your emissions included in the target boundary. Basically, you need to reduce your 2/3 of your scope 3 emissions by the 1.5 degree centigrade trajectory.
I thought you say 2/3 of scope 3 boundary, let's say it's 10,000. 2/3 means 1,000, right? Or 2/3 times 15 categories, which one?
No, let's say, for example, your emissions for scope 3 is, let's say, 10,000 tons CO2e per annum. So you need to 10,000 CO2e per annum. So you need to have at least 2/3, like around 6.3, around the 60 or 6,700 of tons CO2e in your boundary. Basically, that you have to reduce by 1.5 degree centigrade pathway. Yep, 2/3 of the scope 3. But that's only for the near term. For long term, you need to include 90%. But I mean, there are pros and cons as well for each of those. I mean, we generally cover that when we do the 2-day decarbonization for what is the, yeah. All right, so I mean, for SMEs, the key thing is the only difference as compared to MNCs is in the near term, the scope 3 targets are not required or not mandatory. So, but you still start to measure your scope 3 footprint. But for MNCs, scope 3 target in the near term is a must. And regarding the offsets, there was a question. Offsets is not counted as reduction as per SBTi. So you really need to reduce your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. All right. So I mean, this is the slide on the different types of offset, on which offset can be used for neutralization as well. So as you can see, there are total 7 different types of offset. But if we talk about the neutralization, what needs to be done right at the end of the net zero journey is these 2 types of carbon offsets. And these are divided based on how long the storage of that carbon is, whether it is short-lived or whether it is long-lived, like almost like a permanent removal and storage of carbon. So the short-lived storage of those removals are afforestation, reforestation, and soil enhancement, ecosystem restoration. And why this is less permanent? Because you might have seen a lot of forest fires and all. So once the tree sequesters the fire, if there is a forest fire, it can go back into the atmosphere as well. Then we have long-lived. You might have heard of the engineering technologies like direct air carbon capture technologies, and then bioenergy carbon capture as well. These can be used for your neutralization as well. Yep. Oh. So this one is it, the purple and
the purple color and the white one, because in the legend you say it's allowed for neutralization, right? So
correct.
The white one is not allowed.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
okay.
And that's what I was trying to tell you. This is the slide. So
okay.
these 2 can be used for your neutralization.
So let's say as a company, if I build a lot of renewable energy, I cannot do much with the REC thingy.
No,
is it true?
I mean, that is totally different. That is renewable energy certificate. That is fine. This is about the offsetting, carbon offset.
Oh, the 10%.
Yeah, this is about the 10%, correct. But REC, you can start to use today itself, and it will reduce your scope 2 actually. There's no issue with the renewable energy certificate. That's totally fine.
Oh, this for the 10%, the one that you mentioned just now.
Yeah, this slide is for the 10%, correct.
So only for the forestation and also the CCUS something.
Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, there's few more technical details about the CCUS. As you can see, this is not purple, right? And there is a reason for that. And the reason is CCUS is basically when you're burning the fossil fuel, but at the end of the chimney, you have your carbon capture. So basically you're still emitting and then taking it back. So there is no direct removal from the atmosphere. And that's why it is not considered as a neutralization.
No additionality.
No additional, exactly, correct.
Thanks.
Correct. All right, but I mean, these can be used for beyond value chain mitigation. As I said, right, it won't contribute to the reduction, but it is encouraged. It's not a must. You can still buy those carbon offsets and claim carbon neutrality and other things. All right, so let's go to the decarbonization, like how to decarbonize. So you need to have a decarbonization plan, and we call it like a feasibility analysis or your roadmap for decarbonization. Decarbonization is going to take place. It is already taking place. Government is taking action. Government is promoting more and more renewables in the grid. So even if you don't do anything, you will be decarbonizing your operations, and that's uncontrollable decarbonization basically. So that's not under your control. The ecosystem is changing, everything is changing, and that's how you are decarbonizing your emissions as well. But then there are controllable decarbonization levels as well, which is specific to your business, to your operations, that you can implement. Some of the examples are basically if you can change your internal combustion engine fleet to electric vehicles. And yeah, the catch is the grid should be green as well, not just by changing how you're charging the electric vehicle matters as well. And then you can have improvements in your production processes. You can have energy efficiency practices. You can have more circularity in your business. You can have a new business model. All those interventions will lead to those controllable reductions as well. So when we deliver this project with the client, it takes months to come up with this chart. Basically, this is a very, very simple representation, but in reality, it can be very complicated. But one thing, as you can see, I think there was a question earlier. We expect the companies to grow. And when the companies grow, we expect their emissions to grow as well. So it's not like we are saying, oh, stop working, stop growing your company. Companies will grow, and with that, their emissions might grow as well, but they need to take that into account when they're strategizing for their future, how they're going to reduce it. That's a very, very simple representation of how to decarbonize. And just to share with you some of how the reduction can be done under scope 1 and 2. For scope 1 and 2, renewable energy is by far the easiest, most economically viable, and it makes total economic sense as well to install. If you have a big roof, I believe a lot of people might have already reached out to you. They can be zero capex type of solutions as well. So just put solar panels or procure renewable energy. And we have done some work with some of the F&B companies here in Malaysia. They were an SME. We did a lot of energy audits and all. So they installed something called solar thermal. Basically, the panel doesn't just generate the electricity, it generates hot water as well. So they were able to reduce some of the steam consumption basically, and another company was able to reduce their LPG consumption basically, because they were using those for cleaning utensils and some disinfection as well. So they can use solar generated hot water for those purposes, and that will help them. I mean, for SMEs, yes, it's a big amount, I'll say, not really big, but every drop count basically. If you can have similar solutions, you can, at the end of the year, you can have a lot of savings if you combine all these reductions. Next is on the lighting. Lighting is used everywhere. Like for example, and lighting, I mean over here, we are all using, I think LED lights already. LED lights are more efficient. So I believe no one is using, the traditional lights, conventional lights, because LED are more efficient and they're cheaper as well. So it makes total business sense. And there might be a lot of providers who might be providing lighting as a service business as well. So you don't have to invest anything in a capex. They will come, they will install, they will just charge every monthly in terms of how much the charge is, and they will do the free maintenance as well. If anything gets spoiled, they will replace it as well. So those are some of the, then they are like switch off policies as well. A lot of big organizations are coming up with the switch off policy. Basically after some time you need to switch off. Companies are coming up with timers as well. Yeah.
My company scope 1 and 2 will be another party scope 3, correct, conceptually?
Not necessarily. Like for example, your scope 2 will be someone else's scope 1. Like for example, power generation plant, they are burning fuel to generate electricity. That is their scope 1, and that becomes your scope 2. Like your scope 2. Scope 2 comes from electricity purchase, right, mainly. So you're purchasing electricity from a power generator, right? And when they're generating electricity, they're burning natural gas or they're burning coal to generate that. So that's what it will be scope 1 emission for that power plant company. And that will become your scope 2, basically. So it's not necessarily your scope 2 will be scope 3. Your scope 2 will be someone else's scope 1. All right. So I mean, yeah, you can have a lot of sensors enabled based on your occupancy and all that will help you reduce your energy consumption through lightings as well. Next is through cooling. Here in this part of the world, we all use cooling, whereas in Western world, they use heating as well. So installing sub-meters, like for example, this conference is going on for a lot of rooms. So if we have sub-meters installed to measure how much energy, cooling energy is being utilized in each of the rooms, depending on the square foot of area, we can identify which is consuming more, which is consuming less, whether the set temperature is correct or not, whether the temperature set is much lower than what is expected to be. So all these can be done in terms of cooling. Then we work with one company in Philippines as well, JB Tech. We help them in replacing the refrigerant unit with the inverter install model. Inverter install model is basically the one doesn't switch on and switch off regularly, but it can regulate, and that can help to basically have much more efficiency. It can save up to 30% of the emissions. Next is on individual parts upgrade, and also the refrigerant gas was upgraded. It was suggested to them, and that will help them in reducing their carbon emissions, and at the same time, it is profitable for the business as well. So these are just actual practical examples that we are showing to you that decarbonization doesn't bring at a cost. Rather, it can help your business as well. It can help you reduce your costs as well. Next is on the boilers. If a lot of you are using boilers as well, boilers have a lot of wastage and all. So if it is a regularly serviced boiler, you can save a lot of cost in that as well. And you might have heard of heat pumps as well. So if you can utilize heat pump, which is fired by renewable energy source, you can reduce your energy consumption as well for the scope 1 and 2 using boilers. This is another case study from one of our the partners that we work with in Malaysia. We use the flue gas economizer. I mean, we suggested to them economizer is basically just a heat exchanger. If you install that, it will help you improve the efficiency of your system. Then also installing a preheater, pre-air heater as well, it improves the efficiencies and everything. And definitely the leakage and everything you do. Then if you're using a compressed air system, that consumes a lot of energy as well. And compressed air, if you have been into a compressed, basically the room, you'll find it very hot. So there are ways to extract that waste heat and maybe heat up the water that can be used as well. So these are some of the measures how you can reduce your energy associated with the compressed air. Next is with the process itself. You might be using a lot of processes, more like automatic, like the conveyor machines and everything. First step is basically designing. If you design them properly, how you can reduce the energy consumption, that's the best way. But in case it is already in operation, you might have to figure out the best way to operate the machines as well. Motors and drives, typically motors and drives will operate for 24/7 and they consume lots and lots of energy. And typically the capital cost for buying a motor is much less than what you spend on running that motor. So always go for high energy efficiency motors. It might cost a bit more, but look at the life cycle cost of those motors and it will definitely give you payback on whatever you're investing in your motors. Then again, the steam systems, a lot of energy is lost because of the leakages and all. So insulate the steam systems, make sure your water cycle is proper, you're dosing anti-scalent and all those things to make sure your steam system is proper. All right, the last part is about implementing the plans and monitoring the progress, basically. So, I mean, we have already talked about the net zero, why we need to do the net zero, what are the reduction strategies, how you can implement all those. But to ensure your roadmap is there, you need to do two more things. One is the North Star, and North Star is basically the visual representation of your decarbonization pathway, which can be used for your internal as well as for external communication. Basically, it's a visual thing, which I'll be giving an example in the next slide. So you need to make that North Star for your company, and you need to have a roadmap catalyst as well. Basically, those who will enable the implementation of your plan. So these are the two more elements or ingredients in your roadmap to net zero. So this is just an example of how the North Star looks like. And as you can see over here, there are on the extreme left-hand side, these are kind of the criterias, and you can have these for near-term, mid-term, and long-term as well. Clearly charted out pathway, which can be easily communicated internally. Internal communication is equally important as compared to external. For external communications as well. So try to develop something similar for your organization as well. What are your targets? Near, right, immediately what you're going to do. Mid-term, maybe by 2030, what you're going to do. And by long-term, which is by 2050, what are the different targets? And depending on the business you are in, you need to have these what are the operational changes you're going to bring into your business. Then what are the different, how you're going to work with your suppliers, basically because your scope 3 will be most significant. So how you're helping your suppliers to reduce their scope 3, their emissions, which will help you reduce your scope 3 emissions as well. So this is just some example. It may or may not be relevant to your business, but try to take this as an example and try to chart out something for your own business as well. But it can take a comprehensive effort, and typically clients will hire a consultant to help them chart out this type of trajectory in a more quantitative manner as well. Next, I was discussing about basically the catalyst. There are two main the roles of the catalyst. One is on the governance part. So basically, someone needs to be a champion in your organizations will be championing this decarbonization, and they need to update the management and the board on a regular basis on the progress, how it is going. And first and the foremost thing is your board should have a buy-in on this basically net zero, that this is important for your business, and as an organization they need to reduce these emissions. So that's why governance, you need to have a KPI and measure those on a regular basis, update the management. There's something called PDCA, plan, do, check and act. So you need to do similarly for your decarbonizations as well. And then the financial analysis, every organization has a limited budget, so you need to ensure you're putting your budget in the right areas for your decarbonization. So that's where anyone has heard of MACC tool, marginal abatement cost curve tool. I mean, it was first introduced by McKinsey, and it is used for, it's a very common tool used in the field of decarbonization to prioritize what you should invest first in your decarbonization, basically. We're not going to too much details of MSCC because we don't have that much time today, but yeah, that's the role of the catalyst. And these are some of the reporting which you can do. A lot of you might be doing the GRI reporting already, but there is CDP. I'm sure some of you might be doing the CDP reporting as well. Then GHG protocol, you're using TCFD. I was speaking to some of them during the lunchtime. They've already started to do the TCFD reporting as well. And then that will become more and more important. I think soon they will change the name to ISSB requirement. TCFD has been merged with ISSB. And then the science-based targets are there as well, which we have already spoken about. So you can commit to science-based target and then work towards reduction as well. So just to summarize, what's the formula for your business sustainability strategy? You have to summarize into 3 parts. One is be transparent. Transparency is the key. You might have heard of the word greenwashing. So if you don't want to be, it can be intentionally, unintentionally. The key is being transparent. Whenever you are publishing your sustainability report, be transparent what you have achieved. Even if you have not achieved the targets in line with that 1.5 degree centigrade pathway, why you are not able to achieve. Just be transparent that you have given your best effort, but still you are not able to achieve that day, that's fine. There are always future years to reduce or compensate for those gaps. Next is collaborate. So you have to, this is not a single person or single organization's game. You have to collaborate, work with your suppliers, work with your customers, and all have to basically work towards the common goal of net zero by 2050. Last is innovate. We are talking about changes. We are talking about fundamental changes in the technology, like solar, EV, all these are technology which have already evolved, but we need much more technologies to evolve. So innovation, R&D is key for all of us to achieve net zero by 2050. All right, that's the end to my presentation. I'd like to invite Wei Ang to thank you. Yeah, by the way, any questions from anyone before?
I have a simple question, just for concept. Company use a company employee use a company Shell card, petrol card.
All right.
So that's what, scope 1 or?
So I have to ask, so it's a shared car, is it? And
No, the card itself, no car, his own car.
Own car, all right.
Just a petrol card.
If it is a own car and they are using it for commute, everyday commute, is it? From their home to office? So that will be under employee commute under scope 3. So there's a special category for that. But if the car was basically owned by your company, basically your company was the owner of that car and the company was filling in the fuel, then it will be scope 1 emissions. All right. I'll hand it over to Yang.
Yes. All right, thanks, Prannoy. Yeah, so we had to do a bit of a reshuffling of the agenda earlier because of the technical glitch. So yeah, thanks for the patience. So I'll just dive right in to introduce about the ASEAN SME Climate Change Guidelines. I mean, while I understand that there's actually no SMEs in this room, but I think the resources are still very relevant to organizations that are starting out in their climate journey. So, I mean, just to give a bit of a background and some of the highlights of the guidelines. So here in Southeast Asia, it becomes clearer every year that the impacts of climate change are no longer a distant threat. So we do see quite a lot of heat wave, flash flooding in cities, and extreme weather events are really increasingly becoming yearly affairs. Yeah, so the region is really highly vulnerable to climate change. We see our economy is increasingly exposed to both physical risks resulting from the weather events as well as what we call transition risks as well. So some examples of transition risks would be investors looking to shift to fund more sustainable business models and supply chains. And we do see that this shift is increasingly picking up pace. Mic closer. Yep. So SMEs remain as a backbone of the economies across Southeast Asia. They contribute between 1/3 to 1/2 of the GDP and can account for more than 90% of employment in some of our neighboring countries. However, despite their substantial impact, SMEs currently find themselves ill-equipped to address the impact of climate change on their business. So with this backdrop, a set of guidelines was developed to provide SMEs with a framework for understanding the impact of climate change on their business, along with some of the practical steps and tools to prepare them for both climate change mitigation as well as adaptation. These guidelines were developed as part of the support to the Thailand Institute of Scientific and Technological Research, as well as the ASEAN Secretariat, with funding support from the Canadian Trade and Investment Facility for Development. Sorry, next slide, please. So we approached the guidelines through a 4-phase approach. We started with a comprehensive desk research complemented by early engagement with SMEs through surveys as well as active outreach. Yeah, so building upon this foundation, we crafted a draft of the guidelines, and next we convened a capacity building and validation workshop, bringing together both SMEs and our stakeholders before we refine the feedback into the final guidelines that is now available as a website. So just now some of you have already scanned a QR code to access the the carbon emission calculator that Prannoy had presented earlier. So that's actually part of the tool of this climate change website. Next slide. Yeah, so the development of the website really helped to ensure broader access to the guidelines and really helped to scale up the knowledge transfer for SME networks across Southeast Asia. So I have the pleasure to share some of the highlights of the information available on the website. Next slide. Yeah, so importantly, we start by articulating a framework for SMEs to see how climate change can impact their business and why they need to be concerned and start planning their climate actions today. So we provide a summary of the climate targets and commitments made by ASEAN countries, and then we introduce the types of climate risks that SMEs are exposed to and the range of opportunities that they can tap on as a result of mitigating and adapting to climate change. Broadly speaking, there are 2 types of climate risks, as you can see over here. I block out the other parts, but I will talk about it subsequently. So there's physical risk as well as transition risk. So for physical risk, it's also being categorized into 2 types. So we have what we call the acute risk. So this refers to extreme weather events such as your floods, your cyclones, your heat wave as well as droughts. And then there's also what we call chronic risk. So this refers to the longer term shift in climate variables. So some of the examples would be increase in sea levels as well as increase in mean temperature. Next slide. So in Malaysia, we know that floods are an annual phenomenon due to the northeast monsoon that brings heavy rain from November to March. And in recent years, we see that Malaysia has endured a series of severe floods, and they can be attributed to overdevelopment, deforestation, and the changing climate as well. So during the December 2021 flood, over 60,000 people nationwide were displaced, and this led to overall losses of about 6.1 billion. Based on an assessment of public assets and infrastructure, living quarters, vehicles, manufacturing, business premises, as well as agriculture.
Excuse me, can you go back to the previous slide on physical risk?
Yeah, so beyond the December 2021 flood, more recently we had the March 2023 flood. So that have displaced over 50,000 people across 3 states. And in Johor, dozens of power substations had to shut down and 130 roads were damaged. Next slide, please. Yeah, so moving away from your physical risks, there's also the transition risks. So these are the risks that are associated with the shift towards a low carbon, sustainable economy. So first, there's your policy risks. So as we know that as governments worldwide step up their efforts to combat climate change, we see new regulations and policies emerging. So this could affect your operations, your supply chain, as well as your costs. Next, we have your technology risks. So rapid advancements in clean technology can disrupt industries. So some example would be the rise of electric vehicles, renewable energy, or eco-friendly materials. Market risks. So we know that consumer preferences are gradually shifting towards sustainability. For businesses that don't align with such values may face declining demand or declining market share. And finally, we have reputational risks. So the public as well as the stakeholder perception of your environmental responsibility can really impact your brand as well as your customer loyalty. Next slide, please. Yeah, so ASEAN countries have all set climate mitigation targets, and some have also announced their ambition to achieve net zero. So typically we see that countries have set the ambition of net zero by 2050. So they have pledged to achieve their goals through measures such as investing in renewable energy sources, boosting gas use to produce electricity, and also cutting the use of coal. So all of which can be seen as a policy risk for businesses if it's not mitigated. So for Malaysia, it has made a commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and it aims to cut its carbon intensity by 45% by 2030 as compared to its 2005 level. Recently, the National Energy Transition Roadmap was also launched, setting out the roadmap to accelerate the energy transition and providing a framework to pivot away from fossil fuels. So as we shift towards a cleaner and more sustainable future, key sectors of the economy are going to have to play their role in achieving this goal. We mentioned just now technology risks and market risks. This can all affect a wide range of businesses and supply chains due to a shift in choices of energy sources, materials, equipment, and logistics. Next slide. Yeah, so while this shift can be a risk, it is also the source of a range of opportunities for SMEs as well. SMEs can discover more cost-effective ways to operate through improving resource efficiency, using a low-emission energy alternative, and developing new products and services that may improve their competitive position in the market. And lastly, resource diversification is also a key opportunity for SMEs to build resiliency to business disruptions. In Malaysia, with the clean energy transition that comes up with the National Energy Transition Roadmap, there are vast opportunities from solar panel manufacturing. There's also battery energy storage to EVs charging facilities. So all of these developments will help to boost investment opportunities in green growth, and this will likely also benefit SMEs that are in this space. Yeah, next slide. So just now we touched on more on the how. So beyond helping SMEs understand, I touched on more on the why. Yeah, so beyond helping SMEs understand the impact of climate change on their business, the website also hosts a range of resources to help companies prepare for climate change. So there's a questionnaire to guide businesses in identifying their risk impacts. We also introduce insurance as a risk transfer mechanisms for SMEs. We suggested some roles and responsibilities for senior management as they consider how to integrate climate change within their business operations. We also list some of the considerations that businesses should have before making a low carbon technological investment. The concept of scope 1, 2, and 3, as Prannoy discussed earlier, it was introduced as a concept, and we also provide a tool on the website to help SMEs measure their scope 1 and 2 emissions. There's a simple monitoring and evaluation framework for SMEs to track their progress. And lastly, we also provide a list of country-level resources to support SMEs in their decarbonisation journey. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, so this is the website that you have used earlier. So the tools include selected emission sources common to the majority of SMEs. Yeah, so it was covered by Prannoy earlier, so I wouldn't share too much about this. Yeah, next. Yeah, so so this is actually the link to the ASEAN SME Climate Change Guidelines. So please feel free to scan the QR code on screen to access the website. Yeah, I will leave this on screen for a couple of seconds. Yeah, so before I move on to my next section, that's on embedding climate risk as part of business process. Okay, I think we can move to the next section. I think you have to exit and then, so all these were covered by Prannoy earlier. Right, yeah. Yeah, next. Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I have introduced to you physical and transition risks, but it's not all doom and gloom. So as taking climate actions can also help to unlock opportunities. And overall, these climate-related risks and opportunities will have significant impacts on your businesses, including on your profit and losses. I will be covering what businesses can do to start considering these risks and opportunities in the next few minutes. Next. Yep, so climate risks differ from your traditional risks in several critical ways, making them more challenging to manage effectively. So climate risks are systematic, meaning that it affects your entire ecosystems, economies, and societies. So for example, a drought can trigger food shortages, which in turn can affect your economic stability, and it can also cause social unrest, creating a domino effect. Climate risks are also often non-linear, meaning that past trends are not necessarily strong predictors of future outcomes. So feedback loops such as melting ice caps as accelerating temperature rise can make predictions uncertain. So this non-linearity makes it difficult to anticipate the timing as well as the magnitude of impacts accurately. It's foreseeable, so the magnitude and future impact of climate change will at least in part be determined by actions today. And while the timing and magnitude of climate change impact is uncertain, we know that there is a high degree of certainty that financial risks from some combination of the physical risks and transition risks will materialize. And lastly, it's irreversible. So many climate impacts are irreversible, at least on human timescales. So for example, species extinction or permanent damage to ecosystem, these are things that cannot be undone. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD in short, was established to assist organizations in understanding and as well as disclosing the financial impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities. So TCFD is really all about connecting the dots between climate and your bottom line. TCFD guides you in disclosing information that's not just important for sustainability enthusiasts, but it's really meant for investors, your lenders, and insurers who are increasingly interested in your climate resilience. So by embracing TCFD, you are doing more than just reporting. You are demonstrating transparency and accountability, which can help to build trust and attract stakeholders who value climate resilience and thereby help in attracting investment and funding. Next slide, please. Yep, so TCFD actually provides a structured approach for organizations to disclose your climate-related risks and opportunities. So this framework provides 4 key recommendations. They are namely governance, strategy, risk management, and lastly, metrics and targets. The governance pillar focuses on leadership and accountability. So it's really about having clear roles and responsibilities within your organization for climate risk management. And for strategy, here TCFD encourages you to consider climate risks and opportunities in your strategic planning. So it's really about aligning your business goals with a changing climate landscape. On risk management, it emphasizes on the need to identify, assess, as well as to manage your climate-related risks. So it also includes the important practice of scenario analysis to really understand what are some of the potential impacts. And the final pillar on metrics and targets, it highlights the importance of measuring and reporting on your climate performance. So it's about communicating your progress transparently to stakeholders. So together, these 4 pillars provide a comprehensive framework to help your business to thrive in a changing climate landscape and to future-proof your business. So just wanted to highlight that TCFD isn't just about ticking boxes. It's a strategic tool that encourages you to think longer term and to anticipate and adapt to a changing world. Next slide. Yeah, so here we have an overview of the timeline of TCFD, starting from its inception in 2017 to help companies understand how to assess, quantify, and disclose their climate risks and opportunities. Yeah, given the time, I won't go through this in detail, so I think we can move to the next. Yeah, so a foundational step for businesses to manage their climate risks start from governance. So governance here, we are referring to the ways decisions are being made, responsibilities are being assigned, and lines of communication are being clearly defined. So when it comes to climate risks, governance plays a pivotal role in ensuring that these risks are not only recognized, but they are also appropriately addressed. So on leadership, effective climate risk management really starts at the top, and leadership support is critical. It helps to set the tone for the entire organization. So businesses can consider designating a specific individuals or team responsible for overseeing your climate risk-related decisions and actions. This ensures that someone within the organization is always championing for climate resilience. Next is about integration into your existing governance structure. So rather than creating new structures, think about how climate risk considerations can be integrated into your existing decision-making processes. So it's about making sure that climate risks are not siloed, but they are discussed and evaluated in relevant meetings and discussion. So this ensures that climate is always on the agenda when important decisions are being made. Staff training, so it's a vital role of governance to ensure that your employees receive the right training on climate risks and how to manage them. So it's about nurturing a culture of learning and development within your organization to build the skills and the knowledge needed to address climate risks effectively. And lastly, monitoring is also important to understand what are the climate risks that's been changing over time. Reporting mechanisms are crucial as well, as they are the channels through which you convey your climate risks to your relevant stakeholders, be it investors, employees, or your partners. Next slide. Yeah, so by establishing a basic governance framework tailored to your organizational structure and resources, you are ensuring that climate risks are not overlooked, but they are also integrated into your decision-making processes. So here we have an example outlining the typical roles and responsibilities of your key department leadership. So from your C-suite to senior management, finance, and your energy departments. So they are available in the website, so I won't go through them in detail. So can we move on to the next? Yeah, so another key area where businesses can start implementing in their business is to identify as well as to assess their climate risks and opportunity. So we know that resources can be limited. So the good news is that businesses can all start small. So a basic assessment is a significant step towards improving climate resilience, and it doesn't really require too much financial or technical resources. You can always start with a qualitative approach to assess the likelihood as well as the severity of your risk. And as your resources grow, you can gradually expand them and enhance it into a quantitative analysis. A good climate-related risk and opportunity assessment will prompt some of the key questions that you see over here. So what are the most cost-effective levers for decarbonization? How do I best respond to climate risks? And do I need to make transformational changes to my business model? Next slide, please. Yep, so here we have an example of a simplified climate risk assessment that is also available in the SME Climate Change Guidelines. And we indicated questions to guide business in their climate impact assessment. And on the right-hand column of the table, we also provided a qualitative indication of the risk impact. However, every business is really unique, so your risk profile and your risk impact depends on different factors, such as location, industry, supply chain, as well as operations. So it's important to focus on identifying risks that are most relevant to your specific circumstances. So for example, on physical risks, you can consider how extreme weather events could impact your operations, your facilities, as well as supply chain. On transition risks, you can reflect about the different emerging regulatory changes that are happening. You can reflect about the shift in market demand and technological advancements that might affect your products, your service, and your position in market. Like one way to actually improve on this climate risk assessment could be to add a column on the likelihood of the risk happening. Yeah, so for example, if your business is located in a flood-prone area, you know that the likelihood is high. So you could indicate it as a high likelihood. Another way to expand on this risk assessment is to map your value chain, and identify potential risks at different stages. So recognizing that risk can arise from suppliers, from customers, as well as from partners. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, so this is just a summary of the benefits of a TCFD aligned analysis. So it helps to improve your risk management. It helps to unlock opportunities to grow, providing business value. It provides investors with more confidence now that you have disclosed aligned to TCFD. And as businesses start to have a good understanding of your climate risk, You'll also be driven to develop a climate strategy aligned to net zero. Next. Yeah, so I will run through the last part really quickly. So there's just some of the support schemes for decarbonization, and it's also available in the website. Next. Yeah, so in our website, we have provided resources to support SMEs across 5 areas, namely your fiscal and financial support, your transaction enablers, human capacity development, as well as feedback and engagement channels. So some of these pillars, such as financing and transaction enablers, have resources that are specific to Malaysia, and I will run through them briefly in the next few slides. Next. Yeah, so there's an example of transaction enablers to help businesses to make informed green investment and purchases is the MyHijau Mark and Directory. So this is a government initiative in Malaysia aimed at promoting the sourcing as well as the purchasing of green products and services. There are 2 distinct features, the MyHijau Mark as well as the MyHijau Directory. So essentially the MyHijau Mark is a logo that consolidates various regional and international green certification, whereas the MyHijau Directory is an online platform serving your procurers, government ministries, and the general public. So it provides information about all green products and services that are being recognized under the MyHijau Mark. Next slide. Yeah, so the MyHijau Directory lists your registered green products and services as a reference for green procurement as well as a green incentive, including the green investment tax allowance and green income tax exemption. Next slide, please. Yeah, moving on to fiscal and financial support, the green technology tax incentive was introduced back in 2014, and the program has 2 key incentives, GITA as well as GITE. So I understand from the previous session that these are ending by the end of the year. So for GITA, it's being designed for companies that are looking to acquire green technology listed on the MyHijau Directory. So these assets can include different types of equipment, machineries, and infrastructure. So by participating in GITA, companies can receive tax allowance on their qualifying green technology investments. For GITE, it's targeted at qualifying green technology service providers that are being listed under the MyHijau. So instead of receiving tax allowance for investments, companies that are eligible for GITE can benefit from income tax exemptions. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, so for SMEs that intend to adopt sustainable and low practices, another avenue for financing support is the BNM Low Carbon Transition Facilities. So this facility is open for SMEs in all sectors that are committed to transform their business operations towards low carbon operations. This includes improving energy efficiency, increasing use of sustainable material for production, as well as obtaining of sustainability certification. Yeah, so that's my last slide, I believe. So just want to make a short conclusion that I think that the time to act on climate is now. So businesses that take proactive steps to address climate risks and decarbonize their operations will reap your rewards. So start embracing the challenge, seize the opportunities, and hopefully together we can shape a greener and more sustainable future. Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure whether we have time for some Q&A. No? Okay, yeah, so sorry, we don't really have time. So if there's anything, can you shift the next slide? Yeah, if there's anything, you can reach out to Prannoy and myself. So our contact, if you scan the QR code, you can reach out to us through our contacts. All right, thanks everyone.